Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have author David Dixon. He is the author of Radical Warrior, August Willich's Journey from German Revolutionary to Union General. That came out in the summer of 2020, I believe. I talked with David about Willich, who was an interesting character, a German-American who was born in Germany, fought in the army there in the 1840s during the revolutionary times, and came over to America, was in the Navy for a little while, and then later joined the Union Army. During the Civil War, had a very accomplished career in the West, fought at the major battles there, including Shiloh and Stones River and Chickamauga and Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge. So he was a very interesting character and at times difficult character, but he was an accomplished tactician and led his unit through some pretty rough battles, as we all know. Those fights out in the West were pretty rough, but he survived those battles up until the spring of 1864 when his career was ended by a sniper. And he probably should have been a little bit more careful, but you know how those Civil War generals were on the front lines, in front of the front lines at times, not thinking a lot about their own safety. But luckily for him, he did not end up like John Sedgwick or Stonewall Jackson. He was wounded, survived, and unfortunately for the Union, he was not able to fight at any of the later battles. And after the war, did not really do a whole lot. He tried his hand at politics again without much success. But his life is really the stuff of movies. I mean, you could definitely make an interesting biopic about him. He not only fought, he was in Libby prison for a little while, but doing what he did in Germany and getting in some fights with Karl Marx in England, and then coming here and fighting in the Civil War as a dedicated abolitionist is a pretty amazing story. And it is a good book. It is a well-written book, and I'm going to be talking with David about that. I hope you're doing well. If you listened to the last podcast, I did not have an introduction with my talk with Michael Scott, but I wanted to get that one out before Halloween, and just things have been piling up here, so I didn't do my usual introduction. I don't know if you all like them or not. It doesn't seem to matter with my numbers all that much, but Michael had been on the podcast before, and he's on other podcasts, so you can certainly check out his other podcast work. But I wanted to settle back into the introductions here with David and just make sure that y'all know what this book is and what this topic is about. I mean, I think we all know about Friday the 13th, but we don't necessarily know about August Willich. What is going on here? It is a rainy, nasty November 1st day, Halloween. The weather was nice, pretty much perfect Halloween weather. The sun was out for most of the day, I would say. It was kind of chilly. We haven't had a lot of chilly fall weather, but yesterday was great. You could go out with a sweatshirt and enjoy whatever you were doing. I'm afraid probably Halloween is going to go down as another super spreader event because people were probably partying and trick-or-treating, and our numbers are already pretty ridiculous. We're around 100,000 per day, or at least we were this weekend, and we've been setting records with the COVID. So try to be careful if you can. I know probably my listeners are, but it's pretty obvious other people are not. And we're heading into the cold and flu season, and those numbers are probably not going to get any better, probably going to get worse. I'm hoping the fact that people will be indoors more will balance out the obvious effect of being in close quarters because schools are still open and people are going to restaurants. I am not, but I know they are doing that. So I don't think this virus is going away this winter, certainly, which probably means not in the spring either. Probably dealing with it at least, well, let's face it, we're going to be dealing with it until we get the vaccine. But on top of that, we got the election coming up, and I hope if you haven't voted, you're going to vote. I have voted. I voted for Biden. I make no secret of that. Democrat all down the line, and hoping Biden is going to sail to an easy victory, and there won't be too much trouble at the polls. I saw that story about the the Trumpsters surrounding the Biden bus. I'm not sure who was on the bus. Was it Biden and Harris or just Harris? Or I don't know who was on it, but it was the Biden bus traveling through Texas, and the armed Trumpsters with their flags and their pickup trucks were surrounding it and did this for hundreds of miles, apparently. So the intimidation will be there, but I don't want to sound optimistic, but I don't think there are going to be a lot of problems on election day. I think you might get some yahoos and idiots at the polls, but I think it's going to be peaceful. Whether all the ballots get counted, that's another story. And Trump, if he is leading on election day, he will probably declare victory, even though we have millions of ballots to come in, and it looks like the early ballots are going the way of Biden. But I'm not going to predict that it's going to be easy. It might be a disaster because there's always a perfect storm that seems to benefit Trump. But I think, at least in terms of who's voted already and what the polls are showing, it's looking good for Biden. So I think if Trump wins, it is not going to be legitimate. But he already won the Electoral College one time. So we have to prepare for the worst. And I am certainly prepared for the worst, and I'm not going anywhere on election day. So it is scary, it's uncertain, but I'm hoping it'll be all very anticlimactic, and Biden's going to win a huge victory, both in the popular vote and the Electoral College. And we can go back to the status quo with all the problems that come with that, but at least we will be relieved of the psychic horrors and quasi-fascism of the Trump era. But we shall see. So I wanted to get this up because, people throw around the idea of a civil war, and I hope we're not headed into that, but we certainly have been through that once. It can happen, and who knows what could maybe push us into that. We certainly have a lot of things that if we were reading a history of 2020, we could look back easily and say, oh yeah, well X, Y, and Z here. Of course they started fighting a civil war, but history doesn't work that way. We're in it, and there's a lot of choice going on and contingency. We don't really know what's going to happen, but certainly we have people that are very angry and unwilling to accept the democratic process. But I'm hoping, as Lincoln said, the better angels of our nature will descend upon us, and we can have 4 years of relative sanity and stability. All right, well, on that note, let's talk about the Civil War and David Dixon's book on August Willich.
This book just came out, and thank you for sending me a copy of Radical Warrior. I enjoyed reading it, and it's been out a couple months now. Is that right?
It was actually scheduled to break on September 1st, but we were ahead of deadline, so they actually brought it out right around the 1st of August.
Yeah. Well, you're a real friend to your editors then, if everything's ahead of schedule.
Like I said, I have a business background, so that's okay. I'm used to that.
Yeah, I take deadlines pretty seriously. It's kind of funny. You hear these nightmare stories about authors who just kind of, they disappear and they don't hear from them for, who knows, months, years even. They walk away from a contract. It's pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. So, well, let's talk a little bit about, I want to get into the book and talk about that, but maybe talk about your background a little, because it seems like you're not quite the traditional person writing an academic book. This is through University of Tennessee Press. It's very grounded and archival research and everything. But maybe just kind of talk about your background and how you got to writing about Willich and writing about the Civil War.
Sure. So you're right. I don't come from the traditional PhD background. So, but history's always been my first love. So my dad gave me a copy of Northwest Passage when I was 13 years old. And the author is Kenneth Roberts. I think it was written in 1937, and it was a book about the French and Indian Wars, and that really hooked me. So I went to college. Undergrad at UC Santa Barbara, and majored in political science. Intended to have a career in politics, and I went and did an internship with a congressman on Capitol Hill, and that pretty much ended that dream. So
why is that?
I just saw a lot of waste, a lot of corruption, and being on the inside there gave me a completely different view of what American politics was all about. So
yeah, a lot of waste, a lot of corruption. That sounds like a familiar story.
Yeah.
How, like, what was the time frame for this? When
So
were you there?
I was there in the late 70s, like I think the summer of 79.
All right.
Whatever summer the gas crisis was going on. So
that was kind of supposed to be the rejuvenation of good government, but obviously, with Carter and stuff, he was supposed to change all that, but obviously you saw a different side to all that.
Yeah, I think there are certain practices that are so ingrained and so systemic that that change is really hard to affect, even with people with powerful positions. So
well, and I think as someone who's done a lot of archival research or history research, generally speaking, I mean, you're going to kind of find these stories get repeated again and again, either in American history or somewhere else. And yeah, I mean, I'm working on a big collection now at my workplace, and there's a lot of material from the late 70s and early 80s. Yeah, they're talking about the same stuff, the same type of corruption and issues. So you grew up in California?
Yeah, so I grew up pretty much all over the country, ended up in California when I was about 14. So I did my undergrad at UC Santa Barbara, and kind of stumbled into a business career. And it was a really good career. I spent 35 years in marketing and sales with Fortune 500 companies, but always planning to do history at some point. So I went back to school, and we were living in Massachusetts at the time, so I went back to school in my mid-40s, earned my MA in history at UMass Boston, specifically with the intent to try to acquire enough scratch to retire early and then do history full time. So that became my goal, and so I've been doing that now for the past 4 years.
Okay. Were you a military brat?
No, my dad was also in the corporate world, so he would get transferred, or we would move with his promotions, and so I ended up living literally all over the country. And then once I entered the corporate world, I ended up moving all over the country. So we lived in New Orleans, we lived in south of Richmond, Virginia, where you are.
Okay.
And we lived in Boston and New Orleans.
All right. Well, I'm familiar with those places, to be sure. So you said you did your master's in Massachusetts?
Yeah, UMass Boston.
Okay. And what kind of I guess with marketing, were you kind of doing a little bit of everything? I guess it was kind of big companies, but they just kind of depend on the campaign or whatever was going on?
Yeah, mostly sales management, so regional sales management, so meeting with customers, working with the marketing department, that type of thing. It's pretty surprising how a lot of these skills and talents transfer. Even you would think that sales and marketing would have little to do with, say, doing history, but there are a lot of transferable skills of public speaking. I mean, even PowerPoint skills, for example, have been very, very useful in this new gig that I'm doing. So yeah,
well,
it's been fun.
And when you were doing your master's, did that entail a thesis or coursework or?
Yeah. So UMass Boston, as opposed to UMass Amherst, is really more of a commuter school, but they have an excellent history department. So my mentor there was Julie Winch. Julie did the biography of the free black Philadelphia sailmaker James Forten. She won an award for that book. And then my thesis advisor was Michael Chesson, and Michael Chesson did his book on the Richmond bread riots.
Okay. And
so
63?
So I had some really great advisors, and the professors at UMass Boston were really focused on teaching as opposed to focused on publishing. So I really had a terrific experience there, and I'm still in touch with a number of my professors from UMass.
Did you like living in Boston?
Loved it. Yeah, we lived south of Boston on the seacoast, and it was a great place to live.
Yeah, I just I'm on the job market, and I applied for a job in Nantucket.
Oh, wow.
Is like, the average house is $2.5 million. So
Exactly.
like, even if I get this job, I'm not sure I could live there. So I guess I'd be taking the ferry, which should be kind of an adventure.
You may want to think about that one because they get some pretty rough weather in.
I'm
in the
sure
winter.
nothing will come of it, but it looked kind of cool, so I figured I'd apply. But it's like, the logistics they're already overwhelming because either we would have to live there, which seems financially impossible, or you have to do some kind of weird commute. Even if we lived on the mainland, I'm sure all the mainland properties are super expensive too. So it kind of summarizes looking for a job in 2020.
Exactly.
But yeah, Boston's a great town, and I'm glad you enjoyed. You got through the winters okay. I mean, you've really run the gamut. You've lived in New Orleans and lived in Boston. I mean, those are two very different places. So when you graduated from UMass Boston, kind of what was the next step there?
So I did my master's thesis on Union supporters in Floyd County, Georgia. And so I kind of fell in love with that whole group of historical figures. I found it, I still find it endlessly fascinating that there was so much strong Union support in the Deep South. So while I was still working, I began publishing articles in a few peer-reviewed journals, but mostly in popular magazines, regional magazines, on these interesting Unionist figures that I had uncovered in my research for my thesis. And I literally mined probably 10 or 11 articles out of that thesis. So it was very productive in that sense. Once I got to the end of that run where I could, and like I said, I was working full time. So once that well ran dry, then I started collecting different ideas for biographical subjects because I really love doing biography. And one of those subjects was this fellow named Charles Anderson, who I was most interested in because in 1849 he gave a really unusual speech for a white intellectual at the time, where he pretty much dismissed the notion of white Anglo-Saxon supremacy, or that blacks were an inferior race. And I just thought this was such an unusual position for a Southern-born politician to take that I thought perhaps someday I would do an article on him. Then so when I got to that point, I Googled him, and I think on page 7 or 8 of the Google search results, I found a small little blog post that talked about this speech that had been recently discovered that Anderson had given after Lincoln, the day of the Gettysburg Cemetery dedication.
Okay.
And I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that I had never heard of this. So I started asking around, and nobody else had ever heard of it. And so I thought, my goodness, this is certainly newsworthy, and I definitely should write an article about Anderson's long lost speech at Gettysburg. So I started researching Anderson, and I found out that this man was really an interesting figure. He was a slaveholder a Texas slaveholder in 1861. So how does he end up following Everett and Lincoln at this important event in 1863? And that story turned into a book, which I published in 2000. I self-published in 2015 while I was still working.
Okay.
And that was a great experience because, I thought it had some trade potential, so I queried about 65 agents. For the trade, got no response.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I was at the Huntington Library doing a lot of research, and fortunately, a lot of Anderson's papers are at the Huntington out here in California, which made it easier. While I was doing that research, I realized that there was another gentleman that was researching the same papers. He had been there the year before. He was an endowed chair at an Ivy League institution. So I emailed him, and no response. Emailed him again, no response. Again, no response. that made me really nervous. So instead of pitching this book to a university press and waiting 2 years for it to come out, I was nervous that I was going to be scooped on this. So I went ahead and published it myself. And fortunately, it really ended up being a great thing. It was a real door opener to a lot of people in the Civil War history and Civil War enthusiast community, if you will. I've spoken all over the country, I think 23 different states on this book.
Wow.
And to your earlier point about the longevity of history books in particular, I mean, this thing just is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, I continue to speak on it, although lately most of my talks have been canceled. But yeah, so it's been a really great ride with this really unusual story, and it was great because it put me in touch with a lot of people in the Civil War community that I had not known, and kind of led me on my path to this next book.
Yeah, and that didn't come out that long ago, right? Is it 2016?
Yeah, it came out at the very tail, I think November of 2015.
2015. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, you have another book out already. Yeah, you're moving at a pretty good clip. Now, this professor that you had emailed and didn't respond, do you know if he ever published anything from that research?
So he did. And it's terrific because so once the book came out, I thought, I'm going to send him a copy of the book in any case. So I sent him the copy of the book, and so I should tell you, it's Harry Stout at Yale.
Okay.
You're probably familiar with. So I sent the book to Harry. Harry was still in the middle of publishing a book on the Andersons, but his book was really an analysis of the Anderson family and how they built their wealth in relation to land acquisition.
Okay.
So it was a completely different topic. I had no, I didn't realize it was a different topic because he never responded. So it was great. I think he cited me like 17 times in the book, so that worked out well. And so his book came out from a trade press, I think it was Basic Books, 2 or 3 years ago. And also during that time, there was another book on Anderson's daughter, because she has a terrific diary that she left at the University of Texas that I consulted. And so there's been 3 books on these Andersons just in the last 4 years or so.
So I'm guessing the papers at the Huntington, they're pretty extensive?
42 boxes, and plus there's a collection at Filson, plus there's a collection at Ohio History. There was an overwhelming number of resources. This was so easy from an archival perspective, and the book could have been 600 pages long, but of course nobody would read it. So it was an author's dream in terms of primary source documents. Yeah. Everything I could possibly want or need was available to me.
And I've heard the Huntington is pretty great. I've never been there, but
it's like Mecca.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. I mean, it is probably the best funded and most beautiful, most welcoming archive that I've ever been to.
Yeah, my advisor, Charlie Royster, I mean, he used to literally live out there for months on end. I wouldn't see a lot of him for up to a year and a half because he was out at the Huntington, but he's from California, so he liked being out there anyway. But yeah, I've heard it. Yeah, like you say, it's the Shangri-La of archival research. Now, did I remember reading Charles Anderson? Was he related to Robert Anderson?
Yes, he was Robert Anderson's younger brother, and there were 18 children in that family.
Oh my gosh!
In fact, their father had their last child when he was 71 years old, and their father was a Revolutionary War hero, and he was aide-de-camp to Lafayette and a confidant of Washington. So he was quite well known in his time, and like Anderson, unknown in our time. So yeah, so they were as close as brothers could be. They had a very close relationship. At one point, Robert Anderson and Charles Anderson were going to go into farming together after Charles graduated from Miami University in Ohio, and Robert Anderson was going to quit the army. This was in 1834, but of course, as we know, that never happened. So yes, they.
So he must have been pretty old by the time Fort Sumter's fired on then, right? Robert
Yeah.
Anderson?
Yeah, so Robert Anderson, I think, if memory serves, was born in 1805, 1807, somewhere in there.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I guess, all right.
He had fought in the Mexican War, and and after Fort Sumter, of course, as you know, he went on to be the commander in the Department of Kentucky, but didn't last long before they replaced him with William T. Sherman, because after his Mexican War injuries and his experience at Sumter, he was basically physically just depleted and probably mentally worn out also.
Yeah, I think we underestimate a lot of the time how much strain these guys are under, and you probably pick your commander, but they either get injured or they get killed, but even the guys who don't, kind of Sherman has his breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
Grant broke his leg or he had an injury during Vicksburg, and
Right.
they have dysentery for a while or so, still running the army. So, well, I'm sorry, Harry Stout, he wasn't very communicative, but it sounds like he sort of was nice to you once his book came out.
Yeah, he's become a friend. He gave me a nice review of my book, and it's just I'm sure he was just you know how it is. You're just neck deep in the archives, and
right.
You're like a little mole in there, and occasionally you come up for food, water, and communication. So he probably was just so deep into it that he didn't respond to this email from some unknown person in California.
Well, I haven't had that problem so much with professors, but I know with editors, it's been like 2 emails, 3 emails, and then I end up sending them something literally through the mail.
Right.
And then they read it. But I'm sorry about 65 trade presses, and were any of them kind of like, did you get responses for most of those? Or?
Well, these were from agents. You know, as you know,
Okay.
you really can't get published with a trade press these days unless you have an agent. So I was just trying to hook an agent, and not being in the literary community, I really didn't have any contacts in that way. So I did the best I could to pitch these agents, and it's a tough time for agents to take a flyer on a new author the way the publishing industry is now. I mean, they're pretty much looking for a sure thing. So
right,
so it just didn't fit the bill, and but it worked out. It worked out great.
Well, that's good, and I admire your persistence with that. But yeah, I think it's like a lot of things these days. It's getting harder and harder to break into any kind of field. But has it done okay? I mean, self-publishing. Are you glad you did it that way and didn't go with a university press?
I tell you what, if I had to do it all over again, I would have gone with the university press with this book, and the book would have been different and better.
Yeah.
For many reasons that you're familiar with. So obviously I didn't have really qualified peer readers. I had some outside readers for the book, but it really would have been much better. So when it came to publishing Willich's story, I really didn't hesitate, and the few people that I talked to all suggested that I do this book with the university press. So that's the way I went.
I debated that too. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do because I got this book coming out on Johnny Cash, but I tried getting it through a trade press, and that didn't really go anywhere. And I said, well, I just want it to be the best book it can be. So, went up and it got peer reviewed and everything. So I'm happy with it, but it's just so hard to kind of get everything you want with a book,
Right.
But yeah, let's talk about Radical Warrior. And well, first of all, you just pronounce how do you pronounce his name?
So my German colleagues advised me to pronounce it Willich.
Willich, not Willich.
Or not Willich. But but like anything else, I mean, most of his American peers in his time pronounced it Willich.
Willich. Okay. All right. Well, how did you come across this guy? I mean, he's a pretty amazing character.
Yeah. So, like I said, after I published my first book and started doing these speaking tours, I developed a lot of contacts in the Civil War community, if you will, both on the scholarly side and also on the enthusiast side. I had a couple other projects in mind, but like I said, I really wanted to do a university press book, and so I put out feelers to my friends, and I said, okay, I have certain criteria that I want this next subject to meet. They have to be someone who hasn't had a full-length biography done, someone who's really connected to important events or say first-tier characters, and then it has to be someone who has there's a lot of primary source documents available to work with. So I sent out my feelers and developed a list of like 10 candidates, and then I polled about a dozen of my closest friends in that world with those 10 candidates, and Willich easily was the number one choice of those folks. So I thought, okay, so I looked into his brief biographies, and his life story was really compelling, and I'm all about a compelling narrative in a biography, so I dove into it, not knowing what obstacles I would face.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, like with any book, it's sort of gratifying and terrifying at the same time, and you keep just kind of going into these rabbit holes. And
exactly
that this guy lived, as long as he did is kind of amazing, just given, well, the fact that he's in the military and kind of the time period with diseases and all that. But he was kind of a risk taker, would you say? I mean, he's kind of like danger.
Yeah, he was definitely he was probably a risk taker to the point of where you would question his judgment at times. So
right.
On the one hand, you could say someone is very brave. On the other hand, you might say that they were foolish at times, because he was so committed to his causes. He was such an ideologue. He was all in, and in doing so, I think you see a lot of this in the Civil War, where these charismatic leaders are leading from the front, and in the heat of the battle, they're trying to inspire their troops, and they do things that may not be the wisest thing to do given the situation, and
right.
They end up getting killed. So yeah, you're right. The fact that he was not killed in action is pretty remarkable.
He almost was. Severely wounded in 1864 by a sniper, right?
He was. His right arm was disabled, and that pretty much ended his combat career. So
yeah, too bad for him and the Union. I mean, they might have been able to wrap things up a little earlier. But well, let's talk about kind of where he came from and who this guy is. So just kind of give a sketch of Willich and what he did in his lifetime.
Yeah, so he was born in 1810 in Braunsberg, East Prussia, which is now Poland. His family came from the Junkers, the lesser nobility. His father was a cavalry hero in the Napoleonic Wars, and he was quite seriously wounded. That is the father. And he ended up dying when Willich was just 3 years old. So he and his older brother became orphans. And it's really interesting because they were split up. So his older brother ends up going off to live with an uncle who was also a Napoleonic War veteran. And that brother goes into the Prussian military and serves and spends his entire career in the Prussian army and retires a loyal servant to the king. Willich, the younger Willich, August Willich, on the other hand, he goes off to live with an aunt. This aunt marries a fellow by the name of Friedrich Schleiermacher, who many would call the father of liberal German theology, one of the founders of the University of Berlin. So he has a very different upbringing, right? He's taught to question everything, and so he also goes off to military school. He becomes a Prussian army lieutenant like his brother, but then their paths diverge quite significantly.
Yeah, I mean, reading this book, it's almost like a who's who of mid 19th century Germany. I mean, you got you got Schleiermacher, and then doesn't Willich study under Clausewitz at one point?
Yes, yeah. So he is at the military school when Clausewitz is the director. I'm not so sure how active Clausewitz is actually in the running of that school, but he's certainly there, and there's certainly some faint traces of influence that you can read in Clausewitz's work that come up in the way Willich handles himself on the field.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he does, and he ends up being stationed in the Rhineland, and of course this is an area, parts of which had been owned by France in the recent past. So it was a much more liberal area in terms of political philosophy. So he and his comrades in the 7th Artillery really become infamous as the hotbed, if you will, of, let's say, radical liberal or radical dissent eventually in the Prussian army. So you have this tension between the army wanting its officers to have a well-rounded education on the one hand, and then you see them reading books that the Prussian crown has censored because they're viewed as dangerous. So he starts reading some of the young Hegelians. These are the followers of Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, that broke off, like Feuerbach and Moses Hess. Really, Moses Hess being, some might call him one of the fathers of communism. So he and his comrades start reading those folks, and they become more and more critical of the army and its relationship to both the citizens and to the state.
Well, and without getting too deep into the weeds with the politics of the 1840s, maybe just kind of set the stage. So there's a German federation that's been developing since the end of the Napoleonic War. So you kind of have different states that are in this larger German federation, but obviously it's not the Germany that we know now or even later in the 19th century, but maybe just kind of describe kind of what's happening politically and why Willich turns against the establishment.
Sure. So of course, I mean, you can't talk about what's happening politically without talking about what's happening economically and socially too. So there's certainly with industrialization, there's some big changes happening on the ground between, this gap that's widening between the privileged few in the aristocratic classes and the great masses of peasants and factory workers who were not too long before home artisans, and now they're working for wages in factories. So there's that whole situation going on, and then of course you have a number of famines, you have revolts in the 1830s. All of these pressures, these political and social pressures, and particularly in the German states, which is the most literate region in Europe by far, you have a lot of dissent building. So this basically boils over when we get to 1848. It starts in 1847, actually, in Switzerland. But in 1848, you have, Paris and the Second French Republic, and that rebellion and subsequent republic ends up sparking these armed rebellions all over Europe. And it's amazing that it happened so quickly. There was no internet, there was no Twitter, but yet word travels fast, and almost spontaneously, all of these pent-up Democratic, Republican sentiments boil over. So these rebellions break out and all over Italy, Sicily, Hungary, I mean, you name it. And of course they all get crushed except for the French one. And of course it doesn't take long before the French Second Republic ends as well in 1852. So Willich becomes a revolutionary, and he's involved in 3 separate violent rebellions, and 2 in 1848 and 1 in 1849. The 1849 rebellion is probably the most significant, really the only one where there were tens of thousands of armed rebels in a much more organized military organization, but fighting against overwhelming odds. And so of course they get crushed rather easily, and then you have political refugees scurrying all over Europe wherever they can, France, Switzerland, and then eventually London, where most of the influential European refugees, whether it's Mazzini from Italy or all of those folks, end up for the most part in London.
And so for Willich, this is kind of a rehearsal for the Civil War. It's conventional combat mostly in this uprising, but obviously he's on the side with the much fewer numbers, so it doesn't turn out too well. For a different cause too, obviously, but he's in the progressive camp. I mean, he's I think at one point you say he's to the left of Karl Marx, right?
Yeah. And I would challenge you that I don't think it's for a different cause. You know, especially from Willich's perspective, and probably from the perspective of Schurz and Siegel and the other German American generals, they really see the conflict in the American Civil War as precisely the same causes that they fought for in 1848.
Okay. Well, and I think you can frame all these wars in the mid-19th century as kind of essentially being fought along the same lines. There's kind of a consolidation of nations going on. And, later Germany has the wars against Denmark and France and all that. But, this process is certainly beginning, before the Civil War. But what I thought was funny was kind of his relationship with Karl Marx. I mean, Marx he comes across as kind of a jerk in these pages. Kind of, what was your take on him and his relationship with Willich?
Well, it's interesting. Marx, and I think even his most sympathetic biographers, and I've read several Marx biographies, obviously, I think you'd find that most of these biographers agree that this was not the kind of fellow that you want to be drinking buddies with. I mean, he was time after time, even with Engels. But if you talk about Moses Hess, I mean, when he and Moses Hess were good friends, and then as soon as Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto, he started tearing Hess down. So same thing happened with Willich. I mean, they cooperated very briefly early on, but they soon split for both personal and political reasons. So as you said, Marx by the time he gets to London is much more interested in this long-term dialectic that leads to an eventual communist state, and the fact that it might be 100 years and ends up being 70 years, but it would be a long time, and societies would have to go through these economic transformations before they got to the point where they were ready to adopt something like communism. Willich, on the other hand, even though he's been defeated 3 times, he is ready, both in London and even after he gets to America, to gather his acolytes and again go back to Germany and try to use violent means to impose a democratic republic and eventually a communist or socialist regime onto the homeland. So Marx really believes that this is not productive. Marx is certainly right in this case. The timing is not right for this type of wholesale transformation of the entire political, economic, and social order of the German states. Not to mention, at the same time, the liberals are trying to unify these German states. So there's so much going on. There's so many different perspectives here, and Willich and Marx end up becoming bitter enemies. It doesn't help that Willich is making romantic advances on Marx's wife Jenny, while Jenny is banging the housekeeper. So there's a lot of that going on too. There's a lot of personal animosity here between these two. For a time, Willich gets the better of it, but then Marx's talent for character assassination, I think, finally wins out, and Willich is pretty embarrassed and dejected. And really the last straw, like I said, is the fall of the Second French Republic and Louis Napoleon becoming emperor dictator. And so with that, he's lost most of his hopes for renewed rebellion in Europe, and he makes his way to America.
Well, and yeah, I mean, to be fair to Marx, I mean, Willich is no saint either. I mean, there's some things in this book that make him look pretty bad just as a person. But it's funny, and I mean, I'm not sure when you were born necessarily, but I think we both grew up at the tail end of the communist period. Right. And I in reading this, I think we were taught Marx, not that I was indoctrinated or anything, but when we learned about Marx, you never learned anything about him as a person, even in college.
Right.
And I think maybe if they had taught him more as a biography figure, people would be more ready to dislike him and anything that he thought, because nowadays he'd probably be on Twitter and he'd get canceled, for saying something obnoxious. But
Marx
we never
would love Twitter.
Oh, I know. But you always kind of thought of him as this like lofty political scientist thinking great thoughts, and really he's just kind of he'd really get in the gutter with people. It's kind of amazing. When you're kind of writing this book, I mean, did you have any problems in terms of your sources, like with the language barrier, things that were in German? Do you know German?
I don't.
Can you read?
And that was the huge challenge. And in fact, if it hadn't been for collaborating with a couple of key colleagues, I would have given up this project. And I think not only the lack of facility with the German language, but of course the Fraktur print and the old German script. There are so many barriers. The fact that many of the primary resources, even as far as the newspaper resources in Germany, have not been digitized. So there are a lot of obstacles that I think have caused scholars to kind of shy away from the German Americans, not to mention World War II and World War I. So there's just a lot of reasons why we haven't seen more scholarship in this area. So fortunately, early on, I realized that I needed a partner in this endeavor, and I ended up having two. So one was actually a German woman and her husband whom I met at Gettysburg and developed a friendship with, and she was tremendous in terms of translating large passages and even an 81-page pamphlet that Willich wrote explaining his reasons for leaving the Prussian army. So I was able to work with her and have her translate key documents. And then the second person, his name is Felix Zimmermann, and he is a PhD candidate in Germany. He wrote his master's thesis on Willich and is preparing a doctoral dissertation on Willich, particularly Willich and the history of ideas. And so he and I found out about each other through a mutual contact. I went to Germany, and not only did we visit the archives together, but we tramped all the battlefields where Willich fought in the southwestern portions of Germany. And then Felix came over to the U.S. and I took him around to the battlefields, and he spent some time in Cincinnati and New York at the archives. So it was really the kind of collaboration I think that I'm looking to do more of in future work, because there's only so much you can do on your own, and in this particular case, with the challenges with German language and German print, I couldn't have done it without the help of these two folks.
And in terms of Willich's own letters, are there a lot that he wrote himself, or is it mostly other sources?
Yeah, so that was the third thing. That was the thing that again almost caused me not to do this project. So unlike the Anderson collections, which were just a historian's dream, Willich never married, no collection of personal papers. So that normally would be a knockout, but I have to tell you that I mentioned the pamphlet that he wrote about leaving the Prussian army. He also wrote a pamphlet right at the end of the war, a detailed pamphlet on how he envisioned the future of the American standing army. He was a newspaper editor in Cincinnati for 3 years. He wrote daily editorials there. And then the personal letters from Willich in other collections, both in America and in Europe, were unusually intimate and revealing at critical moments in his life. So even though I didn't have, let's say, 60 boxes of material like I had for Anderson, what I did have was of really high quality, and like I said, it was the timing of these letters and the content of these letters were really quite special. So in that sense, I had to dig a lot deeper and go a lot broader to find, say, 80, 100 personal letters of that sort. But it was well worth it because it really gave me a really good insight into the man and his thinking in his life.
And so are there letters that he wrote, he's writing in English after a certain point? Is that right?
No, he's almost always writing in German. And so, yeah, so I would take these, I would take the transcriptions of these letters, send them to well, I tell you what, you can plug these into Google Translate. It will give you, at best, 60 to 70% translation. It's not going to give you much, but it'll give you enough so that you can see what's in the letter, kind of get an idea of the context. And so when I found the letters that were really important, then I would send them to my translator to have them literally translated.
Okay.
So
wow.
You can even do that. You can even cut and paste actually with Fraktur, and it will sometimes work, which I just did through experiment. And so Google Translate recognizes Fraktur print, and you can get a rough idea of what it says, and then you send it to the translator for a literal translation.
Well, with your first project, you said since it was so rich archivally speaking, when you went into the second book, were you kind of resistant for a while to ask for help, or did you realize right away, like, I'm going to need some major help with these translations and everything?
Yeah, I realized really very early on that I was going to need help. And then because I had feared I was going to be scooped on the Lost Gettysburg Address, I really did that work pretty much in my own little bubble. And I also realized that was a mistake. And so in the course of doing this, I've employed a lot more outside readers even before we got to the peer readers with the press. So I certainly, this was much more of a team effort, and the first book was really too much of an individual effort, looking back.
Well, I think that's a good lesson to learn. I mean, to a certain degree, you got to do what you got to do. But I mean, I was kind of raised, if you want to call it that, in grad school to kind of do everything by yourself, and we'd hear about professors that had grad student assistants or whatever, and I think some people kind of look down upon that as like, you're not doing it all yourself, then it doesn't really count. But I think after doing one book, certainly you realize that it's good to ask for help from people, and obviously if you can't translate it, you're going to need someone. But if you started this book after your first book, going kind of front to back with you did this all in 4 years, is that right?
Well, I did the research in about 3 years, and then the writing and the publishing took about a year. So when I pitched the book to various publishers, I had already completed the first draft manuscript.
Right.
So that was done, and then, but I must say, the peer readers and the editors had really terrific input. So I mean, the book changed a lot during that last year, and it made it a lot better.
But that's a pretty good clip. So were you pretty much working on this a full-time job? Yeah,
I mean that's really what I did. I mean, I retired early so I could do this. So again, I didn't have the pressures of another job to go to, and I also, to your earlier point, I didn't have the pressure of doing it all myself because it was something that was important to building my CV, right? So I could use a collaborative approach because I wasn't being evaluated on all my own original scholarship. And it is a biography. So, I mean, I certainly, there's limits to what you can do or the theses that you can prove in a biography. So I tried to balance that by incorporating the research of a lot of people, particularly in the transnational areas, and Andre Flesch and Don Doyle, and I mean, Andrew Zimmerman, you can go on and on and on. So a lot of those people were really important to me in reading their work, and so I could take this, what I thought was a really compelling and interesting story, and make it also, somewhat scholarly significant.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is. I mean, it's a very rich book in terms of, well, your sources, but also with a lot of Civil War biographies, sometimes there's either the temptation or the source limitations or whatever, but people will do like an introductory chapter talking about what they did up until 1860-61, and then boom, you're in the war. But I mean, about half the book is Willich before he even gets into the Civil War. So you're looking at every part equally, I would say.
I had to really fight for that. And that was,
yeah.
You hit on the most important point for me, because, I mean, there have been great biographies done of Siegel and Schurz. But if you look at those biographies, they spend about 25 pages on, to your point, on the experience in Germany. And so I don't know whether that's marketing driven or whether that's source driven, but I really think it's important, particularly when you have these 48ers like Willich is 42 years old when he emigrates. So, I mean, you really have to understand how he developed his radicalism and his political beliefs before he gets to America, to understand why he was so early and enthusiastically in support and really jonesing for the Civil War long before the Civil War started. I mean, he wanted it to come.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I know you got another talk at once, so I don't want to keep you forever, but maybe if you can walk us through his wartime career, because it's impressive and it's interesting, and again, the things that he goes through and manages to tell the story afterwards, it's pretty amazing. So just kind of talk about what he does during the Civil War.
Sure. So he enlists as a private in the all-German 9th Ohio. He's 51 years old at this time, so he lies about his age because the governor of Ohio is not allowing anyone over 40 to enlist, at least early in the war. He's quickly made adjutant and then major, and he becomes really the father of the regiment. His colonel, Robert McCook of the Fighting McCooks there, calls himself, quote, merely the clerk to 1,000 Deutschmen. So it's more or less Willich's regiment in terms of drilling. And of course, Willich knows the language. McCook isn't fluent in German. And they have some good early engagements, but by August of 1861, Willich is awarded his own command in the 1st German Regiment from Indiana, which is the 32nd Indiana Infantry. And he really goes to great pains in recruiting for this regiment, and his soldiers end up being on the average about 2 years older than the average Civil War soldier. They're fitter because a lot of them are recruited from Turner societies where they've been both drilling and doing gymnastic exercises relentlessly. All of his company officers have combat experience in Europe, mostly from the revolutions, and they're also very hardy because they grew up in urban areas, so they're very resistant to disease, let's say. So this hardy bunch ends up in their first engagement at Rowlett Station in Kentucky in December of 1861. And long story short, they're outnumbered 4-1. They face off with Colonel Benjamin Terry's Texas Rangers cavalry. They use a hollow square defense to defend against that cavalry. It's very successful. They kill Terry and stave off that attack. It's a big morale boost for the Union because the Unions had a terrible year in 1861. So to have this little victory in December is quite a good thing. Then, of course, he ends up at Shiloh in April of 1862. On the second day, his regiment makes 5 successive charges. He changes front 9 times. At one point, his soldiers outrun their support on both flanks, so they're really excited. He stops them. He rides around to the front of the line with his back to the enemy and starts drilling his soldiers in the manual of arms. In the meantime, his soldiers are dropping in the ranks.
Right.
So Lew Wallace writes his memoirs. He calls it the most audacious act of bravery that he saw in the entire war. So as a result of that, he's promoted to brigadier general. Next major engagement, unfortunately, is on the Union right at Stones River. And we all know what happened there. The Union Army was completely overrun on the right. He's captured, ends up in Libby Prison, where he spends a lot of his time thinking about his Prussian Army training and coming up with several really innovative ideas for when he's exchanged. So he is exchanged. He ends up at Liberty Gap in the Tullahoma campaign, where he institutes this new technique that he's devised. It's really adapted from skirmish tactics he learned in Europe, and he calls it advanced firing. And this is a technique where you assemble your line of troops in 4 ranks instead of traditionally in 2 ranks. First rank fires, the fourth rank moves up, and they fire. And the third rank does this all during this time. Of course, the ranks that have just fired are moving back to the fourth rank and reloading. So by the time that they get back up to the front, they're all loaded and ready to go. So this allows him to have continual firing while he's advancing, and it's really a devastating technique, almost similar to the Spencer repeating rifles that are just kind of coming on board. It's that kind of impact.
Right.
Then he's
so by
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
sorry. So by 1864, are other armies adopting these tactics, or how does, like, because I've heard about that in Lee's army during the Overland campaign and stuff. What are the differences, or is it essentially the same idea?
Well, I can only really speak to what was happening in the Army of the Cumberland, because that's where I was focused. But I have not heard of advanced firing being used in Lee's army. So if there are instances of that, I'd love to hear about them. 2 other brigades ended up using it at Chickamauga, where Willich also used it. But the anecdotal evidence is that when Thomas took over for Rosecrans after the disaster at Chickamauga, Thomas was much more conservative, and advanced firing and a lot of the other things that Willich was doing based on his Prussian army training were no longer tolerated. So Thomas was very much of a by-the-book kind of guy. So the innovation I think that Willich brought forward, you don't see after Chickamauga. You don't see it anywhere that I've seen documented in the Army of the Cumberland. It pretty much disappears.
Okay. Well, I should say what I'm talking about. Lee's army is very tenuous, and maybe just had more to do with concentration of troops and not so much like a 4-rank tactic, something like that.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, so he survives Chickamauga, and at Chattanooga, talk about what happens at Missionary Ridge.
Yeah, I think what happens at Missionary Ridge is still controversial today. My reading of it is, of course, you have a situation where Thomas directs his troops. Grant and Thomas are together, obviously, but Sherman's having a tough time breaking through on the northwest end of the ridge. So Thomas sends his corps, or his army, forward to the base of Missionary Ridge, where they quickly dispatch the Confederates in the rifle pits there. And then the legend is that, spontaneously they make the decision to scale the ridge, which is a pretty awesome feat if successful. And I think this is an instance where maybe the legend has outstripped the evidence, because Grant had meetings with Thomas the night before. I think there was always the intent, if possible, to take Missionary Ridge, but somehow the communications get scrambled, and so particularly at the division level. So a lot of the different division commanders have different understandings of what to do. Some say we should stop at the base of the ridge and take the rifle pits, and others say no, we should just keep going. But what is clear is, and Willich mentions this in his report, that once they get to the bottom and they have all these guns and cannon trained down from this height, it is absolute suicide for them to stay there. So whether or not they understood the instructions to take the ridge or not, they're going to take the ridge because they just have to keep going. Otherwise, they're going to be in a shooting gallery. So they do take the ridge, and they scramble up there. It was probably, I guess, I don't remember who it was. One of the Confederate, Claiborne or someone said it broke the back of the Confederacy, but it was quite a blow to Confederate morale at that time.
Yeah, for sure. Now, were you able to go to all these battlefields, or have you seen them before?
No, I went to all the battlefields.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And was that helpful?
Oh, I think absolutely, particularly in the case of Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge. The geography there, it's just something, I think you're really derelict of duty if you're writing any chapters on any battle and you don't walk the field with someone like Lee White or Jim Ogden at Chickamauga, for example, who really knows his stuff and can really give you context. And so yes, I did walk all the battlefields. Plus, when I did the chapters on these different battles, I sent those chapters to the people that I thought were the experts on those battles and asked them to review them, because I'm not an expert in military tactics.
No, those battles are complicated, but no, it's fun to go to the actual field, but it is also helpful to look at the terrain, and usually it's a lot harsher than you think it is.
Exactly.
Yeah. You hear about it, but it's definitely different when you're there, especially when it's hot. I know it wasn't Missionary Ridge necessarily, but other battlefields, just, in the summer or whatever, must have been brutal. Okay, so he's there at the major battles, but then he gets wounded, and it's May of 1964, correct?
Correct.
And he kind of tries to stay in the army, but he's never in another battle after that. That's right?
That's right. Yeah, he's post commander at Cincinnati for a time, mainly trying to cut off shipments of arms to Copperheads. He does lead his brigade back after the war in Texas when they're doing mop-up exercises there, and Phil Sheridan is concerned that there might be a resurgence of Confederate or neo-Confederate activity in Texas. And so he spends a little time in Texas, and then he's forced mostly by his health to resign his commission. So
well, and one thing I was kind of wondering about, and how much you had wondered too, like kind of about his personal life. Did you talk a little bit about that? But he never married. He never had any children. What do you kind of make of that?
Well, I think, and some scholars have made more of it than others. One of the leading Marx scholars, Professor Jonathan Sperber, I believe he's at University of Missouri Columbia. He believes that Willich was gay, and his evidence for that is Marx and Engels, and that's really the only evidence I've found of anyone suggesting that he was gay, in my research, of course, I found out several, I'd say a half dozen instances of his romances with women. So, it's hard to really say without any firm evidence either way. But yeah, there are some folks out there that feel like his sexuality was somewhat ambiguous.
And of course, Marx had every reason to, insult him.
Right,
Marx
right.
did not like him at all, so
Right,
he could have been using that. But it's a very well written book, and you've obviously done your research. And Willich he's a really interesting guy, and so I'm hoping people that it definitely tells you something different, not just about the Civil War, but what's going on in mid-19th century Europe. And to see someone, would you say he pretty much he stuck to his ideals kind of all the way through his life?
Yeah.
He mellows a little bit, but he's pretty much still on board, right?
Yeah, I think he changes his tactics when he moves to America, abandons communism very, very quickly, and develops his own ideas of more of a socialist republic is where he'd like to see things go. But yeah, I think the bigger lesson out of this story is really the nature of the American Civil War itself. So, and the role of these transatlantic radicals like Willich played in the war. So they're fighting. They are not fighting this war to save the Union. In fact, that word Union in a political sense, not a labor sense, that word Union never comes out of Willich's mouth in any correspondence I can find before or during the war. So, Willich is fighting this war as a continuation of the struggles in Europe for social justice, for economic justice, for human freedom. And so these are, when you say he stuck to his principles, those were his principles. So he's fighting for, in today's parlance, he's fighting for social justice, really. And
definitely fighting for abolition from the outset.
He's certainly an abolitionist. Yeah, he goes as far as to form active partnerships with blacks in Cincinnati during his time there, and really risks his life in marching with them to protest the execution of John Brown, for example. So he is a radical abolitionist, but not in the sense of the religious fanatics of the day. Yeah, I think you had Manisha Sinha on one of your programs, but so if you look at her take on a broader group of abolitionists that cover many different ideological spectrums, I think you would put Willich in that class of radical 48ers who were abolitionists for perhaps different reasons than say the more famous fundamental Christians in New England, for example.
Right. Well, and you still see this out on social media and conservative circles of people that say, well, the war wasn't about abolition and the soldiers were racist and they didn't care. They just wanted to preserve the Union. But obviously in Willich's case, he's an abolitionist from the outset, and he's already been trained in this kind of way of thinking beforehand. So there's certain commanders, and I've been doing research on one now. They could really hit the ground running once the war starts because they've already envisioned kind of this social change that needs to happen.
Yeah, and the rank and file soldiers, at least the German soldiers in particular, are certainly mostly anti-slavery, but most of them are not radical abolitionists. But when you have leaders like Willich and others who, Siegel certainly also, who are radical abolitionists and who take the opportunity in camp to continually lecture their soldiers on politics, and these soldiers are looking to them as inspirational leaders and really folk heroes from the 1848 revolution. I think it has quite an impact on the rank and file who are mostly not signing up for these same political reasons as their leaders.
Yeah. Well, another thing I think the book does is it gives you a sense of the contribution, how massive the contribution was of German Americans. I mean, you're talking, I don't know how many serve in the Union Army, but it's hundreds of thousands, right?
Yeah. The latest number is about 214,000.
Okay. Yeah. So, everyone kind of has their camp. They say, well, these people are underrepresented in the literature and this one is, but I mean, no, obviously Willich comes from Germany itself, but there's just thousands of these guys who are joining up, and they're derided in a lot of circles as Dutchmen, the immigrants, what are they going to do for us? But the contribution is really significant.
Yeah, they were at 25%. Immigrants, foreign-born Union soldiers were 25% of the Union Army, and they represented only 13% of the population at that time. So they were overrepresented. In my mind, made quite a significant impact, and this includes Irish immigrants as well. 140,000 Irish immigrants.
Yeah, and Franz Siegel, he shows up in this book, and I mean, I don't know if he's not quite the fighter that Willich is, but right. he was important too. So he's not Willich isn't the only one.
That's right.
But David, I know you got another talk at once, so I'll wrap up here. But congratulations on the book. It's a great book, and good luck with it.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
All right, that was my talk with David Dixon. I hope you enjoyed that. Check out his book, Radical Warrior, about the Union General August Willich. Check out his book, and also remember to go out and vote and help the good guys on Tuesday. You can also help me out by buying my book, Marching Masters, Slavery Race in the Confederate Army During the Civil War. Still going for $39.50 on Amazon, unfortunately, but you can get a new copy from me for $30. Just DM me. That is more than $10 off the Amazon cost, because when you factor in tax, you will be paying more than $40. So why do that when you can get it all-inclusive from me, $30? I will sign it if you want. I will write you a very nice note, encouraging note, and you will have that forever. All right, well, this has been American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward, the writer, producer, and editor of the show. Let's pray for peace on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of this week and beyond, and hope Trump is gone by January at the latest. Talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.